The man known to history as Alfred the Great was born at Wantage in Berkshire in the late 840s. The exact year of his birth is a matter of some dispute amongst scholars, though all are agreed it was some time between 847 and 849, with most favouring the latter half of that period. His father was Ethelwulf, meaning the noble wolf in Old English. In 839, Ethelwulf had succeeded his father as the King of Wessex, one of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms which ruled over 9th century England. However, despite being rulers of Wessex, the family quite possibly had a Kentish origin, and were, in effect, blow-ins to Wessex. In any event, the Wessex line of kings had not descended from father to son in the 8th century, and it was only in the early 8th century that the direct line was established, thus bringing Ethelwulf to power in 839. Alfred's mother was Osburh, the daughter of Oslac, the Pinkerna or butler of the Wessex royal household. Her father was an important officer in his own right, and was descended from a family of Jutes, a small Anglo-Saxon tribe which had played a prominent part in the establishment of a political state on the Isle of Wight, off the southern coast of England. One later chronicler described Osburh as a very religious woman and of noble character, and it is possible that Alfred took after his mother to a significant degree. There are no portraits of Alfred extant, or images of him on contemporary coins from which we might glean evidence about his physical appearance, while near contemporary written descriptions are uninformative, generally playing up his handsomeness by comparison with his contemporary rulers, without providing any major details of his actual appearance. Whether these general descriptions are accurate or not is hard to say with any certainty. Alfred was born into a medium-sized family. He was the youngest of 6 children, having 4 brothers and 1 sister, Ethelwith. Of his 4 brothers, one, Ethelstan, the eldest of the 5 boys, would die before he could succeed their father as King of Wessex. But each of the other 3 brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelberth, and Ethelred, would each spend a short term as King of Wessex before Alfred's much longer reign commenced. Given the paucity of sources for the early Middle Ages, it is perhaps unsurprising that we know little about Alfred's earlier life. The best contemporary or near-contemporary account of his life and reign by far is to be found in the Life of King Alfred, written by a Welsh monk by the name of Asa, in the later years of Alfred's life. Asa knew Alfred personally, and was a learned member of his court in the late 880s and 890s. Consequently, his biography, Life, is an invaluable account of the king's life, though one which needs to be handled with some caution in terms of Asa's possible tendency to exaggerate Alfred's achievements. The only comparably valuable source for Alfred's life is found in the early stages of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a large series of annals on English history between the 9th and 12th century. These records are bulked out by numerous royal charters which have survived and other extraneous material of the time. Equally significant are Alfred's own considerable volumes of writings, some on philosophy and ecclesiastical matters, and some on the law codes and politics of late 9th century England. Slim though these pickings might be overall by comparison with the records for more modern monarchs, they still make Alfred by far and away the best recorded monarch of any English kingdom between the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and the start of Norman rule in the 11th century. It is from Asa that we learn one of the most significant facts about Alfred's early life. He did not learn to read until he was 12 years of age, though this was not untypical for a time when the majority of people were illiterate. It is evidence of a late literary blooming for a king who would be remembered in subsequent times as much for his scholarship as his actions on the battlefield. Another major event in his childhood occurred in the mid-850s, when Alfred was around 7 or 8 years of age, when he was taken by his father on a pilgrimage to Rome, a journey which saw them passing through the court of Charles the Bald, king of the Franks and ruler of the largest Christian kingdom of Western Europe. Other details of Alfred's early life are more suspect. Asser reported that when the future king was just 6 years old, his mother set a challenge whereby she would give an ornate book of Anglo-Saxon poems to whichever of her children could memorize them all first. Alfred won the prize, but there is no determining whether this was an actual event which hinted at a precocious ability for learning, or whether Alfred's biographer simply made the event up as a literary device to highlight Alfred's later scholarship. More certain is the fact that Alfred suffered from variable health and would do for his entire life, an illness which scholars are now generally agreed on was Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease. It probably contributed to his premature death in 899, when he was just in his very early 50s. The world Alfred was born into was changing more rapidly than perhaps even contemporaries could have understood. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Western Europe had fragmented into a number of successor states ruled over by various Germanic tribes such as the Franks in France, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Anglo-Saxons in much of Britain. Nearly 3 centuries of disorder followed, a period typically called the Dark Ages. Dominated by decentralized, weak states, this period was then tail-ended by the invasion and conquest of Spain in the early 8th century by a combined Arab-Berber-Muslim army. However, the Muslim advance was checked in 732 when the Franks under Charles Martel defeated them at Tours and pushed them back into Spain. Thereafter, Europe began to make significant strides towards rejuvenating itself, notably in France and Western Germany, which was united into a single kingdom under the rule of Martel's ancestor, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. During his reign, a resurgence of imperial power occurred, such that this period is typically known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne was also crowned at Rome as the first Holy Roman Emperor, a political entity which would last for over 1,000 years. This resurgence was mirrored in England. Throughout much of the 6th and 7th centuries, the country was a miasma of petty kingdoms such as Bernicia, Deira, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and Mercia, each ruling over a region stretching little beyond 1 or 2 of England's modern-day counties. But in the 7th century, a handful of these states began to gain greater power and control over their neighbours, creating more unified and centralized kingdoms. In particular, Mercia emerged in the course of the 8th century as the dominant power in England. By the late 8th century, what has become known as the Mercian supremacy had reached its greatest extent, with Mercia stretching throughout all of central England north to the River Humber and south as far as the mouth of the River Severn. Yet some kingdoms had avoided being conquered by the Mercians. In the north, the kingdom of Northumbria ruled a large area north of the River Humber. To the east was to be found the kingdom of East Anglia, covering the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk, and some of the Fens region. Finally, in the south, a number of small kingdoms retained their independence, including Kent and Cornwall. But the foremost of these independent southern principalities was the Kingdom of Wessex, covering the modern-day counties of Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Somerset, Wiltshire, and Berkshire. It was into this kingdom that Alfred was born. Moreover, Wessex was ascendant by the 9th century in the face of a weakening Mercian state, but all was not well, as we will see shortly. In the dying years of the 8th century, a new and malicious force had begun making itself known from across the North Sea in Scandinavia. This was the political equilibrium which existed as Alfred was growing up. The kingdom of Wessex was also growing ever stronger, with Kent fully amalgamated into Wessex, while Cornwall, the last independent portion of the West Country, was effectively subjugated by Wessex between the 830s and the 850s. But there was also increasing family tension within the royal family of Wessex at this time. We have already seen that Alfred accompanied his father to the European mainland in the mid-850s on pilgrimage to Rome and to visit the court of the Frankish kings. When he returned in 856, Ethelwulf faced an internal challenge within his family as his eldest son, Ethelbald, sought to displace him. The son was supported by several senior figures within the kingdom of Wessex, namely the ealdorman of Somerset and the Bishop of Sherborne. Consequently, Ethelwulf was not entirely able to see off this challenge from his son, and a compromise agreement was reached whereby Ethelbald now ruled the core kingdom of Wessex, with his father essentially demoted to ruling over the Kentish parts of the realm. This arrangement continued beyond his reign. When Ethelwulf died in 858, the next eldest son, Ethelbert, took over the Kentish branches of the kingdom, yet this was a fluid situation, and when Ethelbald died just 2 years later in 860, Ethelbert effectively reunited Wessex and Kent under his sole leadership, a pattern which Ethelred favoured in 865 when Ethelbert died and he succeeded. As a consequence, when Alfred himself succeeded, he would not have had the prior experience of ruling Kent as a scion of the greater kingdom of Wessex. Conversely, he would also not have to share his kingdom, and he would succeed to a regime where power was centralized in his hands rather than being divided amongst other extended family members. Before that succession took place, though, Wessex was plunged into crisis. The first Viking raid in the British Isles occurred in 793 when Lindisfarne Monastery in northeast England was attacked. Intermittent raids continued throughout the first half of the 9th century, generally striking at coastal regions and often being confined to targets in the north of England and along the eastern seaboard. Yet as destructive as these raids were, they were largely ephemeral, with the Vikings rarely establishing any lasting presence in the British Isles. This all began to change from around 865, when several armies arrived in the north and began to set down seemingly permanent roots. The foremost was led by Halfdan Ragnarsson, a Danish warlord who commanded what has been termed the Great Heathen Army in 865. The speed of the conquests was remarkable. The kingdom of Northumbria was effectively overrun in 2 to 3 years between 865 and 867. East Anglia had become part of the territory of the Vikings or Danes by the end of 870. Simultaneously, the kingdom of Mercia, the once predominant power in England, lost an extensive proportion of its territory in 868 and 869. Though it maintained its independence for the present time, in some instances the Anglo-Saxon rulers were allowed to retain their positions, albeit as vassals of the Danes, but gradually the main Viking leaders began to supplant them. Wessex was not unaffected by this. With Mercia and East Anglia largely under their control by 870, the way was cleared for Halfdan to begin striking into the south of England. Consequently, in late 870 and early 871, a series of Viking raids has been carried out against Wessex. Though the southern Anglo-Saxons were not entirely overmatched, several of these had been repelled with victories for Ethelred. As such, there were signs even before Alfred's succession that the Danes were certainly not invincible and would not be able to overrun Wessex with the same ease as they had Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. That succession would come just weeks later in 871, as Ethelred's reign proved similarly brief to his older brothers. He died when he was perhaps as young as 25 or 26, of unknown causes, and although he left behind 2 sons, these were still in their infancy. Given the crisis aroused by the Viking invasions and the movement of the Danes southwards towards Wessex at the time of Ethelred's death in 871, the obvious decision was made. Alfred would be king, as he was the better choice to confront the crisis Wessex found itself in. That emergency would dominate the first years of Alfred's reign. The situation turned especially ominous in the spring of 871 as a new army of Vikings arrived from Denmark, led by a commander who would soon take up the position of King of East Anglia. His name was Guthrum. He would become the key figure amongst the Danes in the south for the next 20 years as Halfdan Ragnarsson eventually turned his attentions towards Eastern Ireland. Clashes were soon occurring again in southern England. Alfred won some and lost others. For instance, an encounter at Ashdown in the Berkshire Downs was a victory for Alfred. But other setbacks ensured that the Danes were soon able to make forays into the heartland of the Kingdom of Wessex itself, around Wiltshire and Hampshire. Then, suddenly, Guthrum simply decided to turn his attentions elsewhere. There seems little doubting that Alfred and his advisers in Wessex agreed to a black tax or Danegeld in order to have some raids stopped. But Guthrum was also distracted by events elsewhere. While Halfdan had reduced Mercia to a considerable extent, a portion of the kingdom had been left independent, and Guthrum now turned west to fully conquer this in 872. He would not resume his attacks on Wessex for several years, giving the southerners a respite in which to regroup and giving Alfred an opportunity to begin introducing military reforms. There were several aspects to the military reforms undertaken during Alfred's reign in order to more fully secure Wessex against the Viking threat. One of the key aspects concerned was what was known as the Fyrd, a species of Anglo-Saxon militia drawn from the freemen of Wessex. Those marshalled under the Fyrd were expected to provide a certain amount of days' military service to the king each year. Under Alfred, this was divided in 2 between those who would be at home in Wessex and those who would be on active military duty. Exactly what this meant in practical terms at the time is not 100% clear. But it seems likely that Alfred instituted a system whereby up to half the population of fighting-age males in Wessex could be called upon at one time if a severe military emergency, such as had presented itself in 871, occurred again. Simultaneously, the Shire Fyrd in each part of the Kingdom of Wessex would be responsible for defending those regions against localized raids. A second major reform concerned the navy. Alfred was generally lionized by historians of later years as being the man who also began to establish England's great tradition of maritime dominance in the English Channel and the North Atlantic. Certainly, he began patronizing the building of ships to a new format, these being powered by 60 oars. In this respect, Alfred was a pioneer, and the 60-oar ship was a staple of English navies for many years to come. Yet there is a danger of placing too much emphasis on Alfred's achievements in this particular respect. The Anglo-Saxons in various kingdoms throughout England would have had a strong naval tradition throughout the early Middle Ages, and we cannot conclude that Alfred simply built a navy where none had existed in Wessex prior to his reign. The third and final aspect of Alfred's military revolution was doubtlessly the most important. This lay in the field of fortification. In the course of his reign, a chain of forts was built throughout the Kingdom of Wessex. These were often built from scratch, though some did reuse the older remains of Roman or Iron Age defensive sites. A burh, as these fortifications were termed, was built within 20 miles or so of every Saxon settlement within Wessex, with a particular proliferation in the coastal regions. Given this, it is clear that they were intended as refuge centres for the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex for times when Viking raids were occurring. To each of these burhs there were then allotted a specific number of hides. These were a form of land measurement, but in this instance were being used to calculate how many men from the local surrounding region would have to provide service during the year in order to first build, then later both maintain and defend the burh. Extraordinarily, the system allowed for the mobilization of 27,000 men throughout the Kingdom of Wessex to serve in some capacity within the burh system. Even if this figure was never fully mobilized, even half this amount of men would have ensured that the burh system played a very considerable role indeed in securing Wessex against the Viking threat throughout Alfred's reign and beyond into the 10th century. We are extremely fortunate to have a detailed account of how this system worked. Found amongst the Cottonian manuscripts in the British Library in London is a document known as the Burgle Hidage. This is an account of the chain of the forts which were established through the burh system, together with details of the arrangements for their maintenance and defence. Although the Burgle Hidage evidently postdates Alfred's reign, perhaps being of the 920s, internal evidence suggests it drew on an earlier version that had been in use during Alfred's reign itself. As such, it is a record of a complex system of administration being used to ensure the security of the entirety of southern England during Alfred's reign. While all these innovations were only just beginning by the late 870s, whatever benefits they could convey were soon very much needed. In 874, Guthrum had completed the conquest of Mercia and installed a puppet ruler named Ceolwulf. To rule over the region, with western England now pacified, he turned his attentions back southwards in 876 to Wessex, the only major power in England which still resisted the Danes. Operating from around the Cambridge region, a series of attacks were launched by Guthrum on Exeter. Clashes followed in this region for months to come, often with vague offers of peace, the swapping of hostages, and the paying of ransoms. During the course of these clashes, Alfred had the closest call of his reign. During the 12th night celebrations on the 6th of January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Alfred's court at Chippenham in Wiltshire. Taken completely by surprise, the Wessex court was overwhelmed. Alfred himself only narrowly escaped and ended up hiding in the marshes of Somerset for several weeks, with a small band of followers attempting to regroup and plan their retaliation. Meanwhile, Guthrum and his Danes had free rein throughout Wessex during the spring of 878. However, it would not last long. As the spring wore on, Alfred gathered his forces about him and was soon in the field attempting to prosecute Guthrum. This would culminate in a famous battle at Eddington in Wiltshire in the first days of the summer. The Battle of Eddington was the most significant military engagement fought by Alfred during his reign. It is typically understood to have occurred between the 6th and the 8th of May 878, near the modern-day town of Eddington in Wiltshire. Unfortunately, contemporary accounts of the engagement are lacking in precise details concerning what happened, yet it seems plausible that Alfred's forces considerably outnumbered Guthrum's. The Danes in England were increasingly divided in the late 870s, and Guthrum appears to have had little aid from Halfdan further north. Hence, Guthrum's raiding party would have been smaller in size than previous ones to have attacked southward. By way of contrast, Alfred had called up a levy on his way to Eddington in early May, and had recruited many more men from the counties of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. As a consequence, he might have had a substantial numerical advantage at Eddington when the battle commenced a week later. The details of the battle itself are equally thin on the ground. Indeed, we do not even know where exactly in the wider Eddington area the battle actually took place. Of the engagement itself, We know from Asser's life that Alfred and his Anglo-Saxons used a dense shield wall against the entire force of Danes, leading to considerable loss of life before the invaders broke off. The army of Wessex then pursued them towards the fortress the Danes had occupied in the region at Chippenham. A siege now ensued for 2 weeks, before the Danes, starving from a lack of resources, sued for peace. Victory at Edington paved the way for the negotiation of the most significant peace terms agreed upon between Alfred and a Viking lord during his reign. The Treaty of Wedmore was a capitulation by Guthrum. Under the terms of it, the Danish king of East Anglia and 30 of his leading followers were forced to convert to Christianity. They were also to leave the lands of the Kingdom of Wessex and move back into the region beyond its northern periphery, effectively East Anglia. This was not an unheard-of arrangement between the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, often resulting in little more than a temporary cessation of hostilities. But there is evidence that Wedmore was a more substantial and long-lasting peace agreement, and although he took his time in doing so, Guthrum did eventually bring his followers into East Anglia and largely honoured the treaty, whilst years later, in the second half of the 10th century, the English kings were symbolically marking the anniversary of the Battle of Edington, indicating that people at the time, and in the decades that followed, ascribed considerable significance to the victory at Edington and the terms agreed at Wedmore. Perhaps, most crucially, it firmly established the idea throughout England that the Kingdom of Wessex would not capitulate to the Viking incursions as easily as their counterparts in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia had in recent times. Under the terms of the Treaty of Wedmore, the boundary between Alfred's domains and those of Guthrum's was fixed along the course of the River Thames, and extended westward towards Bedford. Accordingly, East Anglia became the frontier of what has been termed the Danelaw, the area that Danish control and Danish law was confined to. In another sense, it was also an opportunistic agreement between the two to divide up the rump of what remained of the Kingdom of Mercia, and each take a piece. Another significant aspect of the Treaty of Wedmore was that Alfred received London. The city was not the primary city of England which it would subsequently become at this stage, but it did house a number of significant mints and other civic buildings, and Alfred would take steps to develop it further in the 880s. With the defeat of Guthrum and the establishment of a somewhat secure peace and border between Wessex and the Vikings, Alfred was free to begin actually ruling without the threat of invasion for the first time in his reign. Prior to his own accession to the throne in 871, Alfred had already become a married man. In 868 he was joined with Elswith, the daughter of Mercian nobleman Ethelred Musel. They would have 5 children that we are aware of. The girls were Ethelfled, Ethelgifu, and Ethelrith, amongst whom Ethelfled was perhaps the most prominent, as she would later marry into the Mercian royal family. Of the 2 sons, Edward and Ethelwerd, Edward would eventually go on to succeed his father as the king of the Anglo-Saxons, ruling for a quarter of a century as a highly significant king in his own right. Many matters of government concerned Alfred in the 880s and 890s. For instance, he and his advisers were deeply aware of the critical importance of putting the kingdom's finances on a steady path as a means of preventing future incursions by the Danes from being successful. Indeed, the reason we know so much about the Burr system of fortifications, which were erected throughout southern England during his reign, was that the Burgel Heidage is essentially a record of how the entire system was financed by taking payments from specific amounts of land throughout Wessex. The Burgel Heidage is, in its own right, a statement about the formalisation of the finances of the Kingdom of Wessex, and the improvement of the system whereby taxes were collected and administered, Alfred's own will also attests to the success of his efforts to put the finances of the Kingdom of Wessex on a more secure footing, and there is evidence to suggest that the nascent state's reserves of coin were at a greater extent in the latter parts of Alfred's reign than they had been at almost any previous date. 2,000 pounds of silver were distributed under the terms of his will, a huge sum which indicates the affluence of the Kingdom of Wessex by the end of the 9th century. How might we explain this sudden boom in the Wessex exchequer beyond the simple benefits of administrative reorganization? Some scholars have suggested that Alfred had a keen interest in developing the tin and silver mines of southern England, and these brought in some of the kingdom's additional revenues in the 880s and 890s. Similarly, the expansion of the kingdom would have generated additional revenue, notably the incorporation of the trading centre of London into the Kingdom of Wessex, increasing trade with the Vikings of the North Sea along the southern ports of England might also have brought in additional revenue. But it is clear that one critical plank of Alfred's increasing revenue stream in the 880s and 890s was that he was extracting his own bribes from the Danes to the north to stay out of their affairs. This is striking. The tables had turned greatly from the first years of his reign, such that Wessex was not capable of being the aggressor on occasion against the Danes of East Anglia and Mercia. The affluence of the kingdom in the second half of the reign is most strikingly seen in the coinage issued during Alfred's reign at the height of the emergency of the 870s. The coins being issued in Wessex were heavily debased, with a much lower silver content, a development which has interesting parallels elsewhere in Europe during the 9th century. The pattern being that whenever the Vikings began attacking a region persistently, the silver content of coins dropped as the native rulers began desperately trying to hire more soldiers to combat the invaders. Yet this debased coinage in Wessex during the 870s quickly gave way in the 880s to a proper coinage with a pre-Viking silver content. The second half of Alfred's reign, in the late 880s and 890s, saw a silver penny circulating in southern England, which had one of the highest silver contents seen in England during the early Middle Ages, a remarkable indication of how the political fortunes of the Kingdom of Wessex changed during Alfred's reign. Part of this financial success was due to London having become a part of the Kingdom of Wessex as a result of the Treaty of Wedmore in 778. The Roman city of Londinium had perhaps a population of as many as 60,000 people at the height of the Roman presence in Britain between the 2nd and 4th centuries, but it was almost entirely abandoned in the 5th century following the Roman withdrawal from the province in 410. It is unclear when the site began to be re-inhabited, but by the early 8th century it was described by the Anglo-Saxon scholar Bede as a trading centre for merchants from overseas. It benefited considerably from being under Mercian rule thereafter, with important mints for coins being located there. Despite this, the wars of the mid-9th century did disrupt the city. As such, it required some attention in the 880s. Alfred ordered extensive repairs to be carried out on the old Roman walls, while the defensive ditch was also recut. These effectively set the boundaries of the city for several centuries to come, and as with so much else in England, Alfred's reign started a process whereby London began to occupy a greater space in England's urban landscape. Additionally, lands were allocated to some of Wessex's soldiers around the settlement at London in the 880s, and the divisions and location of these continue to impact on the street plan which exists in London today between Cheapside and the Thames. It is an indication of the breadth of Alfred's wider achievements that his role as a substantial early English lawmaker is not amongst his most well-known accomplishments, and yet he was highly successful in this regard too. We are fortunate to have a copy of Alfred's own law book or law code, which he issued either in the late 880s or early 890s. On the surface, his approach towards the law was quite traditional, and much of his law code was based on an older Wessex law code instituted by King Ine, the early 8th century ruler of the kingdom, a copy of whose own laws were appended to Alfred's. Equally, the Mosaic law codes and directives of the early papacy were invoked, all to designate Alfred's approach firmly as being respectful of both divine and temporal precedents. But even with this respect for his forebears, Alfred did introduce innovations. The most significant was contained in an opening clause in which Alfred's law code discusses the keeping of oath and pledge. Here, the notion of what constituted loyalty to the ruler was being invoked. Throughout the law code, loyalty to the king was closely associated with obedience to God and the past laws, and as such, harsh penalties could be imposed for those who disobeyed the ruling power. Legal scholars have consequently argued that the origins of the crimes of felony and treason can, as a result, be traced back to Alfred's law code. In this respect, the legal reforms of Alfred's reign established a key plank of the concept of royal power and legal practices which have remained, in one form or another, cornerstones of the English legal system down to the present day. Generally, for Alfred's reign, we are lucky to have had a wide range of documentary evidence which informs us about everything from the state finances and administration to the reform of the military to his patronage of scholarship. However, there is one considerable and somewhat strange blind spot for his rule. We know very little about how the Church fared in the nearly 30 years he ruled between 871 and 899. It is safe to assume that the wealth and fabric of the Church in southern England had been extensively compromised by the Viking invasions and the wars that followed. It is somewhat strange, then, that we do not hear of Alfred making any concerted effort to reform or rebuild ecclesiastical institutions during his time as king. He was certainly a pious ruler, but we do not see the activity which might have reflected this. There are some glimmers of evidence. For instance, Alfred founded new monasteries at Athelney and Shaftesbury, the first new monastic houses in southern England in over 100 years. Of course, this reticence to patronage the Church too extensively may have been due to fears about the resumption of the war with the Scandinavians and the possibility that churches and monasteries in the south of England would prove easy targets for the Danes of East Anglia or overseas Vikings if they once again went to war with Wessex. Victory at Edington in 878 and the subsequent Treaty of Wedmore did not bring conflict between Wessex and the Danes to a permanent conclusion, as the 880s and 890s saw intermittent conflict, though not quite the same existential threat to Wessex's future that had been there in the 870s. One particularly large outburst occurred from 892, but by this time Alfred's military reforms and the burh system had taken such effect that the Danes found it much more difficult to penetrate south into Wessex. Often the clashes took the shape of engagements around the Thames area on the frontier between East Anglia and the northeastern extremities of Alfred's domains. Thus, this large initiative of the early 890s produced little tangible results for the Danes involved, a striking contrast to Halfdan's conquests in the late 860s and Guthrum's in the 870s. Thereafter, the Vikings in the wider North Sea region began to turn their attentions elsewhere, often to the northern regions of France, where they were carving out a large principality in the Normandy region. With the threat posed by the Danes reduced, though never entirely vanquished, Alfred was able, from the mid-880s, to turn his attention to his overriding passion, the development of a learned court at Winchester, the capital of Wessex. He envisaged himself presiding over such a court as a latter-day wise King Solomon, and there were three major facets to the court of scholarship which was developed at Winchester from 885 onwards: Alfred's own writings and scholarly output, the court of scholars which he developed around himself and the royal family, and the educational system which he patronized at the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Alfred the man, as well as Alfred the king, was the breadth of his own learning and scholarship. The extent of Alfred's extant works is very considerable indeed. They include his law book, some translations of Pope Gregory's Book of Pastoral Rule, similar writings on the 5th century Roman philosopher Boethius's canonical work, The Consolation of Philosophy, and the Church Father Augustine's soliloquies, as well as texts on the first 50 Psalms from the Book of Psalms in the Old Testament. These texts are unique for the early Middle Ages in expressing the world-view and inner thoughts of a reigning European monarch. The Alfredian Renaissance in learning certainly cannot be said to have compared with that which had been achieved by Charlemagne in Western Europe in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, but there is no comparison between the two monarchs who actually oversaw them. Charlemagne was illiterate throughout his life, unable to read or write, while Alfred left behind his own substantial corpus of works. Even if Alfred's political and military career had not been as significant as it was, he is still a figure who would be worth studying exclusively for his scholarly output. Exactly when Alfred composed these works is not clear, although it has been observed that Asser, in his biography of the king, most likely written around 893, does not refer to the majority of Alfred's writings. Hence, it might well be the case that Alfred's literary output was the product of a particularly rich period of scholarship in his later years. The texts by Alfred which have survived point towards an individual who was concerned above all else for knowledge for its own sake, but also in order to act as a good king. Alfred conceived of himself as a latter-day King Solomon, a wise king who would guide his people. This certainly explains his pronouncements in some of his writings that the people of Britain had previously prospered when learning flourished amongst them. Additionally, the focus of Alfred's scholarship is indicative of how he conceived of himself as a king. In particular, the fact that Alfred chose to study some of the works of Pope Gregory I is significant. Gregory had served as the Bishop of Rome between 590 and his death in 604, sanctified as Saint Gregory the Great. He is generally understood to have been the most important of the early popes, not least because of his conversion work in sending missionaries to England, notably Augustine of Canterbury and Paulinus of York. In studying his writings, Alfred was effectively trying to understand better the thought of the individual who had paved the way for the political union of England, Gregory having already begun the religious unification of Britain by initiating the Christianization of its inhabitants. Beyond his own writings, Alfred was possessed of a vision to change Wessex into a kingdom of learning. To that end, he established a school at the royal court on one level to educate his children, and on the other to begin inculcating a better standard of scholarship at the heart of government, one which would trickle down through the nobility of Wessex. He also imagined that he would learn from these scholars himself. One who joined him in the mid-880s was his future biographer, Asser. Three others are noteworthy. The first was Plegomund, a learned hermit who, as well as being invited to join Alfred's court of scholars, was also appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury in 890. A third important figure was Grimwald of St. Bertin, A Benedictine monk from France, Grimbald was persuaded to come to England by Alfred, perhaps in order to pass on to Alfred's court the ideas he would have picked up on the continent about Frankish law and government, but the most significant of the members of Alfred's court of scholars was probably John the Old Saxon. A German by birth, John was a revered scholar and was also appointed by Alfred as the abbot of the monastery of Athelney in 888, shortly after his arrival from continental Europe. Some small fragments of his poems demonstrating knowledge of several languages, including Greek, have survived, a rarity for the time, and one which indicates his scholarship. The king's patronage of learning and education extended beyond this hiring and appointment of famed scholars. A rudimentary education system was also being formed in the late 880s and 890s. As with many of the other reforms Alfred instituted, the model was an education system which Charlemagne had patronized in France almost a century earlier. Alfred's school was at the royal court at Winchester. Incredibly for its time, it seems to have included the children of families of lesser birth, as well as those hailing from Wessex's noble dynasties. But, critically, it also prized study in the vernacular. Alfred was clear in his own writings that Latin was still exalted above all other languages, but he was also the first Anglo-Saxon king that we know of to have understood that Old English was a valuable literary tongue in its own right. It is hard to assess how successful all these initiatives were. Alfred's goal, surely in creating a court of scholars and an educational system for the children of Winchester, was to create a learned group of governors and administrators who would be better placed to run the kingdom of Wessex efficiently in years to come. Perhaps he was successful in this, but it is not wholly clear. Our records for the 10th century are so thin that it is difficult to determine the extent of his success in this regard. Yet, if judged on its own merits, it is true in any event that his patronage of scholarship and education and attempts to create a learned society at Winchester was admirable in its own right. But as profoundly important a figure as Alfred was from a literary and scholarly perspective, and as monumentally significant his reign was in securing the survival of the Kingdom of Wessex, and with it the last vestiges of Anglo-Saxon independence from Danish rule, he is best known as the founder of the English nation. Alfred had expanded Wessex's sphere of control north and obtained direct control over London. Although Mercia was allowed a nominal independence after Wedmore, moreover, an alliance of sorts was negotiated with many of the rulers of Wales, and as such, by the 880s, Alfred could lay claim to directly ruling over all of southern England, and having a nominal control over much of the central parts of the country, and suzerainty further west. This forging of a union between the Anglo-Saxon people of England, who were not directly under the control of the Danes, is highly significant. Contemporaries were fully aware of the importance of it. It is unsurprising, then, to find that in the late 880s there are official treaties increasingly referring to Alfred as acting on behalf of all the English people, while some of the surviving charters from this time now refer to Alfred as King of the Anglo-Saxons, rather than just King of Wessex. His counsellor and biographer, Asser, was even more ambitious in referring to Alfred as ruler of all the Christians of the island of Britain. There is an element of hubris in this, for sure. When Alfred eventually died in 899, he certainly did not rule over England in the sense that we would understand it today, but he had laid down the conceptual groundwork for a centralized state on the island of Britain, which would unite the disparate Anglo-Saxon peoples under one king. That is Alfred's achievement as the founder of the English nation. Alfred died on the 26th of October 899, when he was just in his early 50s. The exact cause of his death is unknown, but it is plausible that it was associated with the poor health he had suffered from for his entire life. He was buried in the Old Minster in Winchester in what became a family crypt. Sadly, for an individual who was revered as the father of the English nation, several future English kings, including William the Conqueror and Henry VIII, disturbed his resting place. In the early 12th century, his remains were removed to Hyde Abbey. Then, during Henry VIII's reign, Hyde Abbey was dissolved and demolished, leading to Alfred and his family members being effectively forgotten about at the site in a field. They lay underground for 2.5 centuries before being exhumed during construction of a prison in the late 18th century, at which time the coffins were destroyed and the bones scattered around the area, a wholly ignominious end for the remains of the father of the English nation. The kingdom Alfred left behind was more fortunate. He was succeeded by his son Edward, who in the course of his 25-year reign was able to conquer East Anglia from the Danes. His son Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, was able to complete the destruction of the Viking kingdoms and unite England when he amalgamated Northumbria into Wessex in the course of the late 920s. Viking raids and intermittent conflict would continue throughout the 10th century, but Athelstan was effectively the first Anglo-Saxon king to rule all of England. Perhaps there is no better sign of this consolidation of power within England than when Athelstan invaded Scotland in the 930s, a pattern which would be repeated in the centuries to come and could be said to mark the beginning of the modern English state, at least in terms of power projection. There is no doubting Alfred's immense contribution to English history and the development of the English state. His first action as King of Wessex in the 870s was to finally stop the Viking incursions into England, which had largely destroyed the kingdoms of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria further north. This he successfully accomplished within a few years of becoming king, in part through a military revolution which reorganized the manner in which land forces were used in Wessex, while he also reformed Wessex's navy, and as a result he was victorious at the Battle of Edington in 878 and stopped the southward advance of the Danes. This did not bring the Viking raids to an end, and further attacks occurred with regularity throughout the 880s and 890s. But the existential threat to Wessex's survival had been neutralized, and the system of burhs or fortifications which he established across southern England provided safety and security for his subjects in the years that followed. Away from the battlefield, Alfred was an even more accomplished and complex monarch. He reformed the finances of the Kingdom of Wessex, began developing London in such a way as would make it the preeminent town of England in years to come, whilst his patronage of the church and education rejuvenated England's cultural life in the aftermath of the worst ravages of the Viking invasions. More strikingly, he was a highly accomplished scholar in his own right, producing work on such individuals as the late Roman philosopher Boethius and the influential early Bishop of Rome, Pope Gregory. There is very little to say against Alfred that we know of. He did not wage unnecessary wars which cost the lives of civilians in order to aggrandize himself, nor were there large internal political disputes within Wessex which resulted in the king shedding blood to maintain his authority. He was, by all accounts, a model king. In part, our view of this might be influenced by our reliance on admittedly biased contemporary sources such as Asser's Life, but that we do not have a hostile account of any kind is significant. And then we must consider the long-term legacy of his reign. By the time of his death in 899, the Kingdom of Wessex was being transformed into the State of England. It was Alfred's most lasting and greatest achievement that he not only managed to defend Wessex from the Danes during his reign, but, by the end of it, had established what had become the English state one which endures in an admittedly vastly different form right down to the present day. What do you think of Alfred the Great? Is he fully deserving of the epithet the Great? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.